If it's Friday, Vice President Harris departed Chicago moments ago after a historic acceptance speech, hammering her Republican opponent and wading into thorny territory for Democrats, the war in Gaza. Plus, independent presidential candidate Robert F. Kennedy Jr. suspends his campaign while lashing out at Democrats and the press and throwing his support behind former President Trump. And Fed Chair Jerome Powell says the time has come to cut interest rates as new economic data fuels concerns over the strength of the labor market. Hi there, welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Ryan Nobles in Washington as both campaigns prepare for an unpredictable 74-day sprint to Election Day. Democrats wrapping up a high-energy convention last night in Chicago with Vice President Harris formally accepting her party's nomination for president, leaning into her biography, casting her candidacy as an agent of change and hope, while urging Americans to look toward the future.
Our nation with this election has a precious, fleeting opportunity to move past the bitterness, cynicism, and divisive battles of the past, a chance to chart a new way forward.
Harris choosing not to focus on making history as the first woman of color to accept a major party's nomination for president, and instead striking a more urgent tone, hammering her opponent, former President Donald Trump.
In many ways, Donald Trump is an unserious man. But the consequences of putting Donald Trump back in the White House are extremely serious. Just imagine Donald Trump with no guardrails, and how he would use the immense powers of the presidency of the United States, not to improve your life, not to strengthen our national security, but to serve the only client he has ever had, himself. I will not cozy up to tyrants and dictators like Kim Jong-un who are rooting for Trump, Because, you know, they know he is easy to manipulate with flattery and favors. They know Trump won't hold autocrats accountable because he wants to be an autocrat himself.
The vice president also spoke at length about Israel and Gaza, an issue that has divided Democrats, with one of the biggest applause lines of the night coming as she called for a hostage deal and a ceasefire. Harris also outlining the broad contours of her domestic agenda with vows to restore reproductive rights, cut taxes for the middle class, end America's housing shortage, and protect Social Security and Medicare. Of course, none of it will be very possible if Democrats can't also retake the House and hold on to the Senate. And as Democrats have done the entire week, Harris also attempting to broaden the Democratic tent in her remarks.
I know there are people of various political views watching tonight, and I want you to know I promise to be a president for all Americans. Here, in this country, anything is possible, that nothing is out of reach. An America where we care for one another, look out for one another, and recognize that we have so much more in common than what separates us. Together, let us write the next great chapter in the most extraordinary story ever told.
Former President Trump blasting Harris on social media during her remarks, calling into Fox News to ask why she didn't use her time as vice president to push her agenda. It comes as the Trump campaign is looking to regain some of its lost momentum as independent candidate Robert F. Kennedy Jr. announced this afternoon that he is suspending his bid for president and supporting Donald Trump. And we'll have more on what Kennedy's announcement might mean for the race in just a moment. But joining me now from Chicago is NBC's Yamiche Alcindor, who's been at the convention all week. So, Yamiche, the convention is over. What comes next for the Harris campaign?
Well, it's really a key question here. And last night, Vice President Kamala Harris hinted at that. She said that if her mother was here, that she would be very proud of her, but she would be asking, okay, now it's time to get to work. And that work is going to look like a number of things. While the Vice President and Governor Walz are going to take the weekend, I'm told, to sort of chill out, they're then going to come out and do some traveling, we're told, next week, maybe also an interview, because there has been a lot of talk, and the Vice President has said that she is going to sit down and do a big substantive interview. On top of that, you're also going to see them also doing fundraisers around the country, we're told. And then I'm also told in talking to sources that really around Labor Day is going to be the very, very big push, because this is traditionally when campaigns think voters are really tuning in. Though I should tell you, after this campaign and after this sort of convention here, it's clear that there are a lot of voters all around the country that are already paying attention because of the wild sort of events that happened to get, of course, Vice President Harris at the top of this ticket, Ryan.
Yeah, that's right. Unprecedented, to say the very least. We also have a pretty important event coming up, and that's the debate. Is the Harris team viewing that as the next big opportunity for the vice president?
They see this as definitely a big opportunity for her to speak to America, to speak to voters that maybe she won't reach going to sort of campaign rallies in different places, because this is, of course, expected to have millions and millions of Americans, both Democrats and Republicans and independents, and maybe undecided voters watching as well. So she has been doing debate prep for the last few weeks, going to Howard University, which is, of course, that historically black college where she went to school. I'm told that she's going to continue to do that, and then she's probably going to go down for a couple of days and not be seen publicly while she really zeroes in and digs in on debate prep. They already have someone that they've chosen to play. Former President Donald Trump, that person was also playing that same role for Hillary Clinton in 2016. So she's definitely honing in there and definitely ready. And my understanding is that she's ready in some ways to keep her cool. Obviously, the debate that President Biden had led to him being essentially pushed off the ticket by his own party. So she's very cognizant of the fact that debates matter here. And you can imagine that she's going to be sort of prosecuting the case against Donald Trump while also trying to tell Americans all over the country, I'm someone who's going to really to really keep you at my heart. I'm someone who's going to really be thinking about the middle class. And Donald Trump will not be someone like that, is really what her messaging is going to be, Ryan.
Yeah, Amiche, there's been a lot of talk about this just perhaps being a honeymoon. If it is a honeymoon, it's lasted quite a while, but we're now through the convention. And that's where the rubber really has to hit the road for the Democratic Party. Do they feel like they have actionable enthusiasm here that's going to take them all the way to the polls in November?
Look, no doubt Democrats are feeling really good. Vice President Harris and Governor Walz feeling really, really good. But they continue to underscore that they believe this is going to be a close race. So at all the rallies that we're seeing, they're signing up hundreds and thousands of people to volunteer for the campaign. And they've been messaging that way, saying that they see themselves as an underdog campaign. So we really see a campaign infrastructure that's trying to make sure all of this enthusiasm, all of this energy translates into actual votes. So that's going to mean encouraging people to go and knock on doors, but also encouraging people, even in blue states like California and New York, to make calls to the battleground states. And again, we should expect them to really barnstorm the country, but specifically the battleground states in the weeks and months ahead, as, of course, the November election is just around the corner. Ryan?
And you'll be all over it, Yamiche. Terrific reporting this week from Chicago. Thanks so much for joining us. And as we noted, there is now one fewer active candidate in the 2024 race after Robert F. Kennedy Jr. announced this afternoon that he is ending his independent campaign for the White House.
16 months. I promised the American people that I would withdraw from the race if I became a spoiler. It's with a sense of victory and not defeat that I'm suspending my campaign activities.
A sense of victory, not defeat, and lengthy remarks laden with grievances and conspiracy theories. Kennedy also announced that he is throwing his support behind former President Trump, who incidentally is holding a rally this evening not far from where Kennedy held his event today. And just a few minutes ago at an event in Las Vegas, Trump acknowledged the support and thanked Kennedy for the endorsement, calling him a very popular and terrific person. With Kennedy leaving the race, NBC's Steve Kornacki is here to break down what it could mean with just 74 days until Election Day.
All right, well, we know, obviously, expecting a close election in November, so a development like Kennedy dropping out of this race, could be significant. Look, he was polling. Let's take you through the history of this. We're going to start here. This is when Biden was still the candidate, pre-Harris as the Democratic candidate. And this is an average of all the national polls. So just before Joe Biden dropped out, on average, in a three-way race that included RFK, you see Trump was leading Biden. Kennedy was sitting there at 9.2% on average. And it was a lead there of 3.5 points. Donald Trump was leading Joe Biden. Now, Biden gets out of the race. Harris gets in the race. And that's been a little bit more than a month now. But you see Harris, Trump, Kennedy. A couple things you notice. Number one, in the month since Harris replaced Biden, the Kennedy support's dropped almost in half, now just over 5% on the average. And that Harris support relative to Biden, look at that. That's gone up significantly, almost 7.5 points. The Trump support is more level, only up about a point right there. So you could see Harris actually pulling into the lead here over Trump in the three-way now since he became the candidate. And here's where it gets interesting. What if, the polling's been out there without Kennedy? What does it look like, Harris versus Trump? And here you can see it. Harris still leads, but it gets tighter. Look, in a three-way race with Kennedy, Harris's margin over Trump is 2.7 points. Without Kennedy, Harris's margin over Trump is 1.6. It's a little bit more than a 1-point tightening of the race with Kennedy out, according to the polls. And like these swing states, we talk about them, it's 10,000 votes here, 20,000 votes there. When you're talking about potentially the difference of 1 point, that could be massive. That could be enormous. So certainly that's why the Trump folks are excited to have Kennedy dropping out and getting on board with them. Now, the other thing, again, you notice here, we showed Kennedy support dropping. We see Harris rising relative to Biden. There's a relationship there. I want to show you two groups here. Two major groups where Kennedy has lost the most support since Harris got in the race. Latinos. Kennedy's support has dropped by 9 points with Latinos. Meanwhile, Harris's, relative to Biden, is up 12 with Latinos and younger voters. Kennedy's support has dropped 8 points with them since Harris became the Democratic candidate. Meanwhile, her support relative to Biden's up 17%. So there's been a relationship there. Harris has surged in part because she's taken votes that Kennedy had been getting. Now some of those remaining Kennedy votes may be a little more Trump-friendly. We'll see if they transfer over.
Okay, Steve, thanks for that. NBC campaign embed Catherine Koretsky joins me now from Phoenix, where RFK just made that announcement. So, Kat, walk us through why RFK Jr. reached this decision. He did talk about suspending, not ending his campaign, only removing his name from the ballot in some states. What does this mean for the campaign?
Yeah, so exactly like you laid out there, Ryan, a lot to unpack here. So RFK Jr. saying today that he is suspending his campaign, but not terminating it, but only doing it in a specific amount of states. He had an uphill battle trying to get on the ballot in all 50 states before Election Day, which he was only successful in about 16 states. RFK Jr. saying today that he's throwing his support behind former President Trump. He will still keep his name on the ballot in certain states, in blue states and red states. But the important note about this is he will be removing his name from the 10 battleground states that he mentioned in his speech earlier, where he could potentially play spoiler. We learned just about an hour ago that he officially withdrew his name from the ballot in Pennsylvania, as well as yesterday he did in Arizona, two very crucial states ahead of November. So suspending his campaign, but still keeping his name on some ballots, which we could see how those numbers divide up when we get to Election Day. But big day here for the Kennedy campaign, suspending right now.
And Kennedy did say that he's going to throw his support behind Donald Trump, asking his voters to support them, particularly in those battleground states. How does the Trump campaign feel about that? And what are we expecting that to look like?
So former President Trump just wrapped up an event in Las Vegas before he heads to Arizona, where he will speak tonight and host a rally. Sources familiar confirmed to NBC News that RFK Jr. will also be attending that rally to speak. When Trump did make remarks in Las Vegas, he said he heard he got a very nice endorsement from RFK Jr., so he seems eager about that. There was a fundraising email that also went out. So big day for both of the campaigns, as we're just about 70 days away from Election Day, Ryan.
Okay, Kat Koretsky, thank you so much for being being there. We appreciate it. And we'll talk more about this now with Illinois Democratic Congressman Krishnamoorthi. He is, of course, the ranking member on the China Select Committee. He was one of last night's speakers as well. Congressman, always great to talk to you. Just give me a sense of what it was like in the room there last night. There certainly seemed to be a lot of excitement watching it on television last night. But what was your reaction to the vice president's speech? Did she strike the right balance between reintroducing herself and her policies, but also hitting Donald Trump?
She did. And I think that she also filled out her biography even more for people that may not be familiar with her background. I think talking, for instance, about her mother, about how it was like to grow up in the flats, as it were, in the Bay Area in California. And also talking about the contrast between her and Donald Trump. And I think one of the best lines of the night, in my opinion, was when she talked about, how reproductive freedoms were at risk and how, Donald Trump and his allies want to do X, Y, and Z take extreme positions to further curtail abortion rights. And she said, simply put, they're out of their minds. And that's how a lot of people feel about the extreme positions that Donald Trump and the Republican Party have staked out on this issue.
Maybe expand on that a little bit, because it seemed, at least, when President Biden was still at the top of the ticket, the Democratic message was kind of specifically focused on protecting democracy. It does seem as though the Harris campaign is expanding that a little bit and framing it as freedom more broadly, as you talk about these specific issues and other aspects that Harris focused on in her speech last night. Is that purposeful? And do you think that expands the map a little bit for her to some of these voters that didn't seem happy with either candidate until she got in the race?
I think that it reframes the issue in a way that is very accessible to more people across the political spectrum, which is they don't want the government, involved in these deeply personal decisions of theirs, whether it's reproductive freedom or other intimate decisions. And I think that it brings more people into the fold in terms of understanding why this election matters. I think people are already energized within our party. As you can see from last night, I was there. I've never seen the United Center so packed to the gills as it was. And now it's time to also mobilize independents and maybe even Republicans who would be willing to vote for her. And so talking about this freedom frame, as it were, I think is a very smart move on her part.
She is in an interesting position here, though, because she's talking a lot about the future. She is talking about the baton being passed to a new generation. But she is, as the acting vice president, still part of this current administration. How much does she need to differentiate herself from the work of the Biden administration and outline her own policy proposals? But is there, and should she kind of latch on to some of the things that the administration did accomplish over the past 4 years?
Yes, and I think that she has been. I think whether it's with regard to, for instance, the Inflation Reduction Act and the $35 a month insulin, or whether it's, helping to negotiate the price of 10 prescription drugs, which, by the way, cost the federal government $50 billion a year under Medicare Part D right now, because they have not been negotiated downwards as she and President Biden did, makes a lot of sense. At the same time, I think that she's going to be outlining, on certain issues where she might, take a different position or help flesh out an agenda that hasn't yet been fully realized during the Biden term. But I think that she has that leeway and latitude to do so because she's her own person. And I think people understand that she is not necessarily going to do exactly the same thing that President Biden does, but build upon the foundation of success that he has achieved in many different areas.
She certainly addressed the issue in the Middle East, directly talking about the war in Gaza. That has been a point of division within your party. Obviously, there were protesters outside, unhappy that they didn't feel as though they were getting a strong enough voice inside the room. Do you feel that the vice president went far enough in keeping the issue from depressing the vote in key places like the battleground of Michigan?
I think so. I think that when she said she wants a ceasefire deal in return for hostages and also massive humanitarian aid coming into Gaza, and as I have articulated with some others in Congress, that we must make sure that there's a two-state solution on the table, medium and in the long term. I think that that was another strong signal to the vast majority of Democrats that she's in the right place on these issues. And by the way, I should just say, she sent a very strong message when she also said she's not going to tolerate bowing down to tyrants, whether it's Vladimir Putin or Kim Jong-un, or for that matter, allowing for nefarious activities to continue with regard to Iran or Hamas. And I think that those were all extremely important messages to send, not only to Democrats, not only to voters, but quite frankly, to our adversaries as well.
Do you think, though, that the Democratic Party perhaps made a mistake by not allowing members of the uncommitted delegates to have a speaking slot, to have their voices heard throughout the course of this convention?
No, there are 30 uncommitted delegates out of like 4,200, I think. I mean, I think it's like some very, very small percentage. And I think that it made all the sense in the world to do the program as they did. And for her to address this situation and the issue substantively as she did. And now we move forward.
So, and you move forward with only 74 more days to go. It does feel as though she's still kind of living in this honeymoon. It's probably going to get a lot tougher between now and Election Day. Where do you think she should focus her energy as you move toward Election Day?
Well, I think she's going to be in the battleground states a lot, including in our neighboring states of Michigan and Wisconsin, as you know. And I think she's going to be doing everything she can to explain to everyday, ordinary people how her agenda relates to them. And, how does she address the kitchen table topics and concerns that they have? I think the other thing that's going to happen, as you know, is there's going to be a debate on September 10th. So she's going to be spending time preparing for that. I think it's going to be perhaps the most watched debate up to this point. And I think she's going to do very well. She's going to acquit herself very well. And it's going to be much different than the last debate that we saw.
All right, Congressman Roger Krishnamoorthi, I can tell you on behalf of the Capitol Hill Press Corps, we're at the stage of August recess where we're actually starting to miss you guys. So I hope you come back in the near future so we can chase you around the Capitol. But I appreciate you being with me today.
I didn't think you'd ever say that, but thank you. And by the way, I just have to say, I hope that all of you had your fill of deep dish pizza and all the sumptuous fare in Chicago. We very much enjoyed having everybody, and what an amazing 4 days in Chicago. And the weather, well, it's the same as it is the rest of the year, but it was pretty perfect.
Well, I wasn't in Chicago, but judging by my colleagues' Instagram posts, I think plenty of deep dish pizza was consumed. So I'm sure that they enjoyed it. Congressman, thank you. I appreciate it. Coming up, some big developments tied to the economy as the head of the Federal Reserve delivers a major address saying it's time to act amid new warning signs that the labor market could be weaker than previously thought. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. After months of speculation, Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell is making it perfectly clear. Rate cuts are coming.
The time has come for policy to adjust. The direction of travel is clear, and the timing and pace of rate cuts will depend on incoming data, the evolving outlook, and the balance of risks.
Powell made those comments today ahead of the Fed's September meeting and as data points to a slowing economy. Earlier this week, we learned the U.S. added 818,000 jobs, which was fewer than what was reported through the 12 months that ended in March. 818,000 fewer jobs. CNBC senior economics reporter Steve Leisman joins me now from Jackson Hole, Wyoming, where the Fed chair spoke this morning. Steve, you win the award for the best backdrop of this program today, so thanks for that. I appreciate it. The question now seems to be whether or not the Fed will cut rates, but how large those cuts will be. Did Jerome Powell give any indication of that today?
No, he was pretty clear that they're going to be watching the data pretty carefully to figure out how much to do. If you think about it, you had a lousy July report. We'll get the August report a week or so, or maybe 10 days before the Fed meets again. That will determine, do they do a 25 or a 50? And also, look, there are 19 members of the committee, 12 of them vote each year. So we'll figure out where the committee is on this. Do some of them want to be a little bit more reluctant to cut? Do some of them a little more enthusiastic about it? So you got to listen to what they say and watch the economic data as to whether or not there's signs of weakening in the economy. The economy's doing okay right now. The question becomes, does it start to weaken, and that would accelerate those rate cuts.
And would it be one cut coming in September, or could this be the beginning of a series of cuts down the road?
Yeah, good question. Powell was pretty clear today that it's a series of rate cuts. He's kind of made this clear. That's why it's kind of taken so long. Powell said, you're not going to cut 25 basis points or 0.25% once and be done with it. You're going to do a series of cuts to get back. So he waited until he was very confident inflation was coming back down to their 2% target, that they could really clear the runway for a series of cuts through the end of the year, maybe as many as 4. So you might be talking about the funds rate coming down a full percentage point, and you'll have knock-on effects on mortgage rates and loans that businesses borrow at and loans that consumers borrow at.
And we did receive some revised job numbers that show the economy added more than 800,000 fewer jobs than initially thought. Is that a big flag? I mean, how often do they make a revision like this?
So it's the largest revision since 2009. Just for the record, they revise this data every year. They true it up with other data that they have. And honestly, you know, I study this stuff a lot. I'm still kind of scratching my head over how big a deal it is. It was back in the year ending March 2024. It showed that job growth was still pretty strong, just not as strong as we previously thought. And the other thing is we don't have confirming data in other job data that we have that the job market is weakening precipitously or it's really an area of concern. We get weekly jobless claims numbers every week. They're very well behaved. The GDP numbers, the economic growth numbers look pretty good. The retail spending numbers look pretty good. The last time we had a big number like this, the bottom was falling out of the economy. It was pretty clear all over that we had weakness. So there's also some sense at all, by the way, that there could be some issue with the counting of immigrant workers in this number. So I'm watching it. It's a knock. It's a flag. But I don't know how big a red flag it is just yet.
Well, Steve, that's why we have you to look at all the data, not just one report. We appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Right.
Up next, you're looking at a time-lapse video here of pro-Palestinian protesters marching in Chicago yesterday on the final day of the DNC. My next guest is one of the uncommitted delegates who was in Chicago calling for a ceasefire in Gaza and asking the Harris campaign to allow a Palestinian American to speak at the convention. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. In some of her strongest remarks of the night, Vice President Harris took on an issue that continues to divide her party, the ongoing Israel-Hamas war. Harris said the time for a ceasefire is now and expressed her support both of Israel's right to self-defense and the need to end the suffering in Gaza.
Let me be clear. I will always stand up for Israel's right to defend itself, and I will always ensure Israel has the ability to defend itself, because the people of Israel must never again face the horror that a terrorist organization called Hamas caused on October 7. At the same time, what has happened in Gaza over the past 10 months is devastating. So many innocent lives lost. Desperate, hungry people fleeing for safety over and over again. The scale of suffering is heartbreaking.
But absent from the DNC stage this week were representatives from the pro-Palestinian uncommitted movement who have been negotiating with party organizers in the hopes of securing a speaking slot. On Wednesday, they staged a sit-in outside the United Center, hoping that the campaign would reverse course. When it became apparent they would not, and that would not happen, those uncommitted delegates ultimately decided to end their sit-in and return to the convention. Joining me now is Layla Alabed, a co-founder of the Uncommitted National Movement, to talk more about this. Layla, you did hear from the vice president last night. She did speak about this issue during your speech. Has your opinion about how she would handle the war in Gaza changed?
No, it hasn't changed because, in all honesty, everything that she said is something that we already heard from President Biden. So actually, we haven't seen how she's going to change her policy that is going to be any different from President Biden's unpopular and immoral Gaza policy.
So what would you have wanted to hear then?
What we would have wanted to hear is how she's going to, how she would have addressed the majority of Democrats who want to see a permanent and immediate ceasefire and want to see conditions on military funding to Israel. How can we have a ceasefire realized if we continue to provide the fire?
So she did specifically say that she wants a ceasefire. The White House has been touting her involvement in these diplomatic efforts. Most recently, she was on the White House call with Prime Minister Netanyahu. So I guess what I hear you saying is that it's not just enough to call for a ceasefire. You also want to end the funding the United States is providing to Israel. Is that correct?
Yes, 100%. We continue to send a flow of weapons transfers and weapons funding to Benjamin Netanyahu and his far right-wing government, who continues to be emboldened to drop thousands of bombs on innocent men, women, and children, violating our own international and American laws.
So now that the convention has ended, what is the plan now for the uncommitted movement? How do you plan on making sure that your voices are continued to be heard by the Harris campaign?
We are going to continue growing our movement because our movement is representative of the majority of Democrats. 86% of the Biden-Harris camp want to see a permanent and immediate ceasefire. So our movement is speaking to that. And we are going to continue to grow our movement and really force Vice President Harris to listen to the core base of voters that she needs in November.
I understand that you wish that Vice President Harris would go further than where she currently has as it relates to her position in the Middle East. But it is a far cry from where Donald Trump is on this issue. And an election is ultimately a binary choice. Is there a chance that you personally or your movement will not vote for anyone in November? Is Donald Trump an option? What choices will you have ultimately when it comes to Election Day?
Donald Trump is 100% not an option. This is a movement that was created through the vehicle of the Democratic Party because we are all Democrats. We wanted our voices to be heard at the Democratic National Convention, and I think in many ways our voices were heard at the convention, and we will continue to amplify the voices of Palestinians, and we will continue mobilizing Democratic voters who are aligned with our demands. And there's a number of down-ballot races that are on the Democratic ballot, but also we will continue to grow our movement of Democratic voters to force Vice President Harris to listen to the core constituents of her base, of the voters that she needs in November.
Are you saying then that if you feel that that message isn't getting through or she doesn't provide the substantive policy changes that you're looking for, that perhaps she won't have your vote?
I think that is completely up to Vice President Harris if she's going to decide to make the mistake to continue alienating her core base.
Do you think
it is up to
you think that's what she's doing now? I just want to be clear about that. You think she's alienating the base right now?
I think she is alienating the majority of Democrats who want to see a policy shift, that want Vice President Harris to turn a page away from Biden's current disastrous policy that forced him to exit the race.
Okay, Layla Alabed, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
And up next, the after party. Can Democrats sustain this week's good vibes and enthusiasm until Election Day? I'll talk to my panel of political experts about what's next as both campaigns kick into high gear. You're watching Meet the Press now.
Last year, Joe and I brought together Democrats and conservative Republicans to write the strongest border bill in decades. The Border Patrol endorsed it. But Donald Trump believes a border deal would hurt his campaign. So he ordered his allies in Congress to kill the deal. And here is my pledge to you. As president, I will bring back the bipartisan border security bill that he killed, and I will sign it into law.
Welcome back. That was Kamala Harris last night outlining her policy priorities on the issue of immigration. For more, I'm joined by my panel, Betsy Woodruff-Swan, national correspondent for Politico and an NBC News contributor, Simone Sanders-Townsend, former chief spokesperson for Vice President Harris and now a co-host of The Weekend on MSNBC, and Matt Gorman, a Republican strategist who most recently served as a senior communications advisor for Tim Scott's presidential campaign. So you never stop being a Capitol Hill reporter, Betsy. I was listening to Kamala Harris's proposals last night. She had a lot of these domestic proposals. I'm like, well, you need 60 votes for that in the Senate. You need 60 votes for that in the Senate. You need 60 votes for that in the Senate. I know that these speeches are not designed to be like specific policy prescriptions that are going to immediately be enacted into law. They're more kind of visions, but they need to be grounded in a little bit of reality, right?
Yeah, sometimes they're specifically designed not to be specific policy prescriptions that are going to be enacted into law. But yes, the math problem is a real issue here. Of course, Harris was previously a senator. She wasn't there for nearly as long as some of the esteemed folks you get to chat with every day on Capitol Hill, and doesn't have a particularly deep record when it comes to getting legislation passed, although her record there certainly isn't non-existent. There are important things that she worked on. That said, for her to make promises like this, you know, you've got Republicans on Capitol Hill trying to count up to 60 and not seeing that number happen.
Does that matter to most voters, Simone? They're not counting 60 votes like I am, right?
No, voters are not talking about it like you're talking about it. But I think the lesson of the Biden 2020 campaign rhetoric and then the win is that you want to say what you want to do and what you also realistically believe at a certain point you can get done. And I don't think, though, what she was saying is unrealistic. Now, I am not as, you know, hype on the Senate as some other people that we talk to. I think that is a very uphill battle for Democrats in the Senate. But Gary Peters, Senator Gary Peters, chair of the DSCC, if you talk to him, he says that they're going to defend all the seats except West Virginia, and then that there are pickup opportunities, including Florida and Texas. Very bullish. I am not that bullish, but I think getting getting some different players in the game, no more Sinema, Ruben Gallego instead in Arizona, perhaps some things can get done in the Senate.
I mean, what you're kind of hinting at is that perhaps they're open to a filibuster for some of these policy measures that she's talking about, because even if they hold on to the majority, they're not getting to 60 votes.
Oh, absolutely.
So you're saying a filibuster's on the table?
I definitely think the filibuster's on the table. Senator Schumer has said that, has alluded to as much as that in the last week and a half or so. And I know when it comes to voting rights specifically, the vice president feels very strongly that the filibuster should be done away with for that. So the question is, are there members on board to do that? That is a conversation for post-January 6th.
But it could be a conversation for this campaign, right, Matt? I mean, if Republicans in these battleground states go to their voters who maybe are not fans of Donald Trump, but are worried about a sweeping liberal agenda, do they go to them and say they're going to get rid of the filibuster?
I mean, not yet. You're not going to hear that yet. You heard that in the waning days of the 96 campaign, even 08, where things were not looking good for the Republican at the top of the ticket. Here, get a check and a balance. Look, I think what I've kind of gathered is, I think from both parties, it's not too out of touch with what Simone said, where Tester, they feel might be a little bit gone or getting there. Not to put words in her mouth, this is my mouth, but then, and then also maybe they drag Ohio, Bernie Moreno over the finish line. That's a maybe. We'll see. And the rest is really very much dependent on who wins the presidency. I think that's what you're going to see too. The House, I believe whoever wins the presidency is very likely to win the House.
So let's talk about policy on the other side, Matt, and Donald Trump's policy proposals. He spoke with my colleague Garrett Hake yesterday about his mass deportation plan. Take a listen to what he told Garrett.
Don't have much time, but on your mass deportations plan, it's going to cost billions of dollars. Where will that money come from?
Well, it'll cost trillions of dollars to keep these people, and I'm talking about in particular starting with the criminals. These are some of the worst people anywhere in the world.
If you're trying to deport millions of people, that would perhaps include mixed families. Will you separate families to get to those goals?
Provisions will be made, but we have to get the criminals out. We have murderers in our country. They just walk in.
First off, shades of Mexico is going to pay for the border wall in his answer as it relates to how he's going to pay for it. But then he also doesn't get into specifics about separating families. Is it enough for Donald Trump to just kind of talk in these broad outlines about we're going to deport everyone and not get into the policy specifics?
I mean, the other side of the ticket's doing it, so why can't he? I mean, I will say this, you know, the Overton window shifted in this dramatically. I mean, I worked on the Romney campaign, and it was always, if you were going to have anything on the border security, it was always, you know, what's citizenship, what's legal status. The Overton window has changed, because even Garrett's first question wasn't even about the families, it was about how much it's going to cost. As you even see, like, a majority of Latinos favor some sort of deportation, and I think what you're going to see, J.D. Vance previewed this line as well. Ignore the 18 million right now. Let's get the first million with criminals and out first, and then you kind of take it step by step. I think you're going to expect to hear that from Republicans in the weeks to come.
Who are the criminals? I just want to know, because the data says that the undocumented individuals in this country commit less. It is not the undocumented people who are committing the crimes. It's not the migrants, if you will. More crimes are committed by actual Americans. And so I think that's why Garrett had the questions on the specifics, because if Donald Trump is saying, get the criminals out, how are you deciding who is the criminal? Who are the criminals? Do they look like criminals? Do they seem like criminals? Are you calling down to Guatemala for the record?
The idea that it's feasible is mind-bending. The logistical problems, setting aside the human rights issues, setting aside the constitutional issues, just the logistical problems of finding 1 million people, detaining them, getting their initial home countries to agree to let them come back in. All of that is incredibly difficult, incredibly challenging, and for Trump to make a promise like this, he's overpromising to even the most enthusiastic supporter that you can.
It's one of those promises I talked about. You make these promises on the campaign trail, and then you cannot enact them when you become.
I think, though, the
president.
fact that he's making that and the fact that we're talking about it shows how much the issues change. It's not in any way a political loser. Where saying that in 2012 would have got Mitt Romney in a lot of trouble. Well, it's absolutely not that way now.
And Betsy, to that point, the fact that Kamala Harris leaned into this, what everyone agrees is a conservative border bill that Republicans rejected, and said that she'd sign it into law, that speaks to what Matt's talking about, how this issue's changed, right?
It's a dramatic shift, especially from the Democratic presidential primary, when Harris joined the other contenders in arguing that undocumented immigrants should have access to health care benefits in the United States. The fact that there's been this shift is something that just speaks to the political climate that we live in now. That said, her movement there into the center, will that be persuasive to voters once Republicans launch an ad barrage highlighting her prior statements? Who knows?
Yeah. I'm interested, Simone. We saw a lot of different Democrats speak. It's clear in the beginning, these long winding speeches. Yesterday, it was almost like quick hits, right? Like a highlight reel of all these different rising Democratic stars. Is there anyone that really stood out to you as somebody we're going to be talking about in the next few election cycles as the next big Democratic star?
You know, good question, right? Because Obama, we learned about him 20 years ago, 2004. Vice President Harris, then Attorney General, was on the stage in 2012. I was very excited to see Shamari Figures on the stage, who is potentially the next new congressperson from Alabama, Alabama's newly created congressional district. I thought Jasmine Crockett was really great. I also thought, though, you know, I like to see Pat Ryan. Pat Ryan was amazing. There were some up-and-coming stars as well. Angela Alsobrooks, Senate candidate here in Maryland, perhaps another rising star. We'll see what she does next. And the Tennessee Three, I know they were cut from the speak because the line was long and they had to get Oprah in, okay, and other folks the other night. But I am just very excited to see Representatives Justin Jones, Representative Justin Pearson, and Representative and Gloria, who I know is now running for the United States Senate. The bench is deep. Obviously, Governor Westmore. I mean, I could name a list, but I think this particular stage that happened from Monday through Thursday is a very good representation of the depth and breadth of youth that's within the Democratic Party apparatus. There is not a dearth of folks to choose from when it comes to a next cabinet.
Well, we unfortunately didn't get to the surprise guest that wasn't to be. So marinate on that and talk amongst yourselves about that. Betsy, Simone, Matt, thank you for being here on a Friday. I appreciate it. Still to come, Ukrainian forces step up strikes inside Russia all the way to the Arctic Circle amid a relentless Russian assault in eastern Ukraine. A former ambassador to Russia joins me after the break. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. It's been more than 2 weeks since Ukraine launched its incursion into Russia. And not only has Moscow not been able to push Ukrainian troops out, but Ukraine's attacks into Russia appear to be expanding. Ukraine's armed forces says it now has control over 490 square kilometers in the Kursk region. and released this video they say shows Ukraine's military using American-made bombs on Russian targets. Earlier this week, Ukraine also took credit for blowing up a number of key bridges in the Kursk region, which could disrupt Russian efforts to stop Ukraine's offensive. And just a few days ago, Ukraine carried out one of its largest drone attacks on Moscow. Joining me now is the former Deputy Secretary of State, a former U.S. ambassador to Russia in the Trump and Biden administrations, John Sullivan. He's out with a new book, Midnight in Moscow, a memoir from the front lines of Russia's war against the West. Well, Mr. Ambassador, you're one of the few people who have met and spoken with President Putin. How do you think he's processing this incursion that's now been going on for almost 3 weeks now? How does he handle this level of embarrassment?
Well, it is a severe embarrassment to him, Ryan. This is an extraordinary event. He's had to deal with issues like this before. We called it last year. There was a mutiny by Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner group, that Putin relied on to supplement his military. A mutiny that threatened him with an armored column headed toward Moscow. Again, what's happening now is the Ukrainians have seized Russian territory, vital Russian territory, with important installations there for gas transmission, nuclear power plants. This is a very serious threat that Putin has to take seriously. Therefore, it's an embarrassment for him because it's on Russian territory. And pro-war Russians are asking, how could you have let this happen?
Mm-hmm. And in your book, you write that no matter what he or any other Russian leader might say, Putin's Russia will never surrender. The goal of the special military operation to subjugate Ukraine, never. When Putin or one of his surrogates talks of negotiations and peace, we should acknowledge and treat it as pure disinformation. If we can't trust Putin at the negotiating table, how does this war end? And are the only outcomes really a frozen conflict or an outright military defeat? And how long could that take?
Well, it's going to take as long as it needs to take, which is what President Biden and others in the administration, Secretary Blinken, have been saying. And the reason they say that is, as I write in my book, Putin is not going to surrender any territory that Russia has conquered already. They are not going to negotiate in good faith. They promised days before they invaded Ukraine in writing that they wouldn't invade Ukraine. Who can take them seriously? And what I write about in my book is really how important this special military operation, Putin's war against Ukraine, is to him personally. It goes to his very ethos of what he considers his stature as a great Russian leader. So no, he's never going to surrender.
And we've seen how fraught it was getting aid to Ukraine passed through Congress, and it's unlikely that additional aid is going to get passed very soon, and a lot of it could depend on who wins the election. What's your message to lawmakers who say that funding Ukraine isn't in America's interest or are trying to get concessions on other political debates?
Well, my message, I'm a lifelong Republican. My message to my fellow Republicans is, if you're thinking about this as defending Ukraine's border, supporting Ukraine, yes, that's part of it. But the principal part of this is opposing and pushing back Russian aggression. That's the threat to the United States. The threat to the United States is posed by an aggressive Russia that started a major land war on the continent of Europe. And when that happens, the United States inevitably gets involved. It happened twice in the 20th century. We need to oppose Putin's aggression. We need to oppose Russia. We do that best by supporting Ukraine.
And you also wrote in your book about the things you saw Russia do that may have foreshadowed the 2022 invasion, including amendments to the Russian Constitution that made it illegal to cede Russian territory. Are there things that Russia's doing right now to lay the groundwork for other provocative actions that a lot of us just aren't paying attention to?
Well, you know, it's very interesting because they're always at work, and there are things going on in Russia today that we will only find out about months, years in the future. In writing my book, I looked back at what happened in the few years before the special military operation. Hindsight is 20/20, and my assessment was he had decided some time ago, Putin, that he was going to invade. What Putin's doing now is processing what's happening in the Kursk region, organizing his forces to defeat the Ukrainians, push them back from that incursion, trying to do that with as few forces as they need to take from Ukraine, because it's going to hurt their military operations in Ukraine if they have to draw troops and equipment to defend Russian territory, which was the point of the Ukrainian invasion.
Mm-hmm. Former Ambassador John Sullivan, incredible insight, sir. Thank you so much for being here. We appreciate it.
My pleasure, Ryan. Good to be with you.
And we'll be back Monday with more Meet the Press Now. And if it's Sunday, it's Meet the Press on your local NBC News station. Kristen will have exclusive interviews with Senator Elizabeth Warren and J.D. Vance, who is, of course, the Republican nominee for vice president. Don't miss it. But the news continues now with Sam Brock, who is in for Hallie Jackson right now.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.